Pennsylvania flood insurance. What do you need to know to protect yourself and your home? That's what we're talking about in today's video, so let's get started. Hi, I'm Chris, flood insurance guru. More than a decade ago, I bought a house in a flood zone. It was a terrible experience. I was given the wrong flood zone, I was given the wrong premium, misinformation, and it cost me a lot of money. And that's why in this video today, I hope to help you avoid the mistakes I made and to help you get the right information. And at any time, if you want to check out some of the information in the descriptions of the video here, we've got our website, Flood Insurance Guru, where we've got that learning center there for you. But today we want to talk about a few things for you. We're going to talk about flood zones, flood risks. We're going to talk about flood insurance options, flood insurance costs. And we're going to even talk about some frequently asked questions we get, as well as elevation certificates. So first of all, let's talk about flood zones in Pennsylvania. You know, Pennsylvania has a lot of unique flood risks. Whether you're in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Lancaster, whether you're on the Delaware River or some other part of Pennsylvania. You know, the typical flood zones you have are what's called non-special flood hazard areas and special flood hazard areas. So let's start there. With the non-special, we're talking about areas that start with flood zone X. These are going to be what's called minimum required flood zones by the federal government. But don't let that catch you off guard. 30% of Pennsylvania flood claims still come out of flood zone X. Remember though, when you're in flood zone X, as I said, it's not going to be required here, but you still have a flood risk here. That just means that the federal government, when they mapped it maybe many years ago, these weren't considered high risk areas, but they could be today. It just takes that mapping a while to update. Now let's talk about special flood hazard areas in Pennsylvania. We're talking about areas like flood zone A or AE here. Remember, generally if it begins with A, it's going to be that special flood hazard area. It falls within that 100-year area. This means within an annual period, it's got, a 1% chance of flooding. But that doesn't mean that it's only going to flood once every 100 years. In fact, we've seen 1,000-year flood events happen on multiple events. Look what happened with Hurricane Helene and Debbie and the flooding that it caused in South Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee. Look, if you live in Pennsylvania, you know flooding's a problem, as it happens a lot in Pennsylvania with all the historic housing, the way these houses are built on historic basements, that it does not take that much for flooding to happen in parts of Pennsylvania. Even if you're not in areas like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, some of the main cities in Pennsylvania, if you're in some of these smaller areas like Lancaster, then it's a problem. And you want to make sure that you're protected, and understanding your flood zone is the first step. Now, the other thing is this. Now, if you're in that special flood hazard area and you have a mortgage, it's typically going to be required. So just remember that as we go through this video and you look at purchasing flood insurance, if it begins with A and you have a mortgage, it's typically going to be required. Now, we've talked about those flood zones. Now let's talk about flood risks. First of all, what is a flood risk score? A flood risk score is a score on your property of the overall chance of this thing flooding, typically over a 30-year period. Some companies go longer. There's a lot of different flood risk assessments that you can use as a homeowner in Pennsylvania. You can use tools like riskfactor.com. We built a tool on the Flood Insurance Guru website just for you in these situations that tells you what your score is, how close to water you are, different rating factors, and things like this. You can find it in the description of this video on that flood risk assessment. It's important that you understand, though, how your flood risk is different from your flood zone. Remember, flood zones are used more from a regulatory standpoint when we're talking about whether a bank's going to be required. They may take 5 to 10 years to update these sometimes because of the process. In fact, many times when they are updated, they're already out of date again. A flood risk score, though, could change quickly. If certain things change, like there's a lot of land development in your area, there's a lot of asphalt and cement being laid down, then this could change your risk because runoff could change. It could be that your particular area has a lot more rainfall than other parts of Pennsylvania, like we see in Lancaster. These types of things are used when building a flood risk score. History of flooding. These are all factors here. So that's how to understand the difference between your flood risks and your flood zone in Pennsylvania. Now let's talk about what are your flood insurance options in Pennsylvania. There's really two options on the table here. We're talking about the National Flood Insurance Program. We're talking about private flood insurance. Let's talk about the National Flood Insurance Program first. The National Flood Insurance Program, also called the Federal Flood Insurance Program in Pennsylvania. Look, no matter where you go, pricing should be the same on this program unless you're doing what's called a policy assumption, where you take over somebody else's policy. I did that on my own property. It can be very beneficial because instead of taking out a new policy, maybe this policy has been in place for a few years and you don't get hit with all that rate at one time, but it happens slowly over time. This can be the benefits there of a policy assumption. But these most of the time are only available through the National Flood Insurance Program. There are some private flood insurance companies that offer these, but not the same way the National Flood Insurance Program does with these staged rate increases. Now, with the National Flood Insurance Program, let's talk about some coverages that they offer. They offer up to $250,000 on building coverage, and they offer up to $100,000 on contents coverage. Now, if you're a business owner, they offer up to $500,000 on the building and $500,000 on that business inventory or business contents coverage. Now, it's important to understand that, in 2024, that's probably not enough coverage, is it? In fact, $250,000 probably is not going very far in Pennsylvania with replacement cost, inflation, and everything else. Now, let's talk a little bit about private flood insurance before we get into the pricing and how rates are built and all this stuff. So private flood insurance is just like it sounds. It's through private companies. It's not through the federal program. It's usually through companies that have come together through Lloyd's of London or other reinsurance companies, and they've put together these products for homeowners or business owners. The pricing with one flood insurance company can be completely different than another one. And the reason is they all build their rates differently. They're using a lot of different things. So if you're looking for flood insurance in Pennsylvania, you want to make sure that you work with an insurance agent in Pennsylvania that has access to the National Flood Insurance Program and at least 3 different private flood insurance companies. You want to make sure you work with one that understands how to use a flood risk score to help you forecast your premiums in the future and your risk. You can even download our guide here on the description of this channel of picking the right flood insurance agent if you're at that stage. Now we've talked about 2 options. Let's talk about flood insurance pricing in Pennsylvania. What's the average cost of flood insurance in Pennsylvania? Look, we hear from people every day on this. The average cost that we see, and we're talking about coverages up to that $250,000. On average, what we see in Pennsylvania is around $1,200 a year. On the private, it sometimes could be a little bit more, it could be a little less. But in understanding that flood insurance pricing, we've got to understand what factors influence flood insurance premiums in Pennsylvania. And let's start with the National Flood Insurance Program first. You see, I'm sitting right here in a high-risk flood zone. You're probably thinking, well, that's going to be a big impact on my flood insurance rate. Historically, would be right, but the National Flood Insurance Program changes in 2021 where flood zones are no longer used in determining rates in Pennsylvania or the rest of the country. They're using things like distance to water. Well, I'm literally sitting right here in water, so we know that's going to be a big factor. The type of flooding, in Florida, for example, coastal flooding may have a bigger impact than flash flooding or river flooding or lake flooding like you can see right here. Then they look at flooding frequency. How often are these events happening? They're looking at the replacement cost of your property. Does it cost $500,000 to replace your building versus $250,000? That's a huge rate driver now. In fact, sometimes we see it cost 30 to 40% more as this changes. Then there's the elevation. The more your property is elevated, it could have a big impact. And we go back to elevation, we need to dive deeper into Pennsylvania. So earlier in this video, we talked about historically in Pennsylvania, you've got these really old basements like New York, really anywhere through the Northwest. You've got some properties that are 100 years old. They've got these basements underground. That can have a huge impact on your flood insurance cost. Is your foundation type here? And if it's a basement versus an elevated building or a walkout basement versus a regular basement. So you want to think about that when you're comparing your options here. Making sure people have that foundation right. If you've had a history of flooding, that could have a big impact. More on the private side than it can with the National Flood Insurance Program, because unless you've had 2 claims post 2021 with the National Flood Insurance Program, then the claims variable is not being used there. But with private, if you've had 1 claim ever, it could automatically disqualify you for some companies. Some will not insure properties that haven't had losses within 5 years. Others may be a little more flexible there, where we've seen the threshold there may be a $30,000 claim. If it's above that, it doesn't qualify. Or if you have a basement below ground and it's had a claim, look, there's all these different situations when it comes to pricing and factors here. Now, when we're talking about the National Flood Insurance Program and private flood insurance in Pennsylvania, you want to remember each one of these coverages is going to have a different deductible. And we've talked about what the National Flood Insurance Program offers. Now, on private flood insurance, like we talked about, that building coverage, it can offer a lot more than that $250,000 for you, which is very beneficial for Pennsylvania homeowners. It can offer replacement cost on contents, which the National Flood Insurance Program does not offer. And then it can also that third coverage, additional living expenses for residential homeowners or loss of use for business owners. Where would you use this? Well, you would use this if your property was flooded and you couldn't live in it and it was unlivable and it was going to take about 6 months to get it ready. Then potentially, if you have the coverage there, it could pay for a place to live for the next 6 months. That could be very beneficial because we had a customer this happened to after a flood about 4 years ago, where she had that private policy when her neighbors had a government policy. She had this coverage available. And as she said, it took a lot of financial and emotional stress off her and her family. So when selecting your coverages, whether the National Flood Insurance Program or private, you want to look at all this. You want to look at that proposal and understand these deductibles, because if you pick a $5,000 deductible with a private company, potentially you could have a $15,000 deductible. If you're closing on a home, you want to understand wait periods. Look, if you're closing on a home and you're taking out a loan, traditionally you're not going to have a wait period, whether it's with the National Flood Insurance Program or private. If you're just moving your policy policy, most of the time they can match the renewal. However, the National Flood Insurance Program is a stickler on this, and they're going to have that 30-day wait unless your flood zone has changed. Then they typically only have a 1-day wait. But if you're moving from a private company to the National Flood Insurance Program, you're still going to have a 30-day wait. Their only exception there is the flood zone changed recently or a loan closing happening. So just remember that when it comes to wait periods. So that's your flood insurance options in Pennsylvania. And we've talked a little bit about coverages there. But how much flood insurance coverage do you need in Pennsylvania? Look, you're going to need different coverage amounts in Pennsylvania, whether you're in an area like Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, that may have much higher replacement costs than a place maybe like Lancaster or Hershey. So in order to understand that, we've got to understand what is the difference between replacement cost and actual cash value on your Pennsylvania flood insurance policy. Replacement cost is the actual cost to replace that building. Actual cash value has depreciation and other things being taken out. This means realistically, you may only get 40% of the coverage you really need there. And this is where people get disappointed. Now, with the National Flood Insurance Program, typically you have to insure it for the max coverage available or 80% of replacement cost. With private, you've got to insure for 80 to 90% of replacement cost in order to get that, or it's defaulting the actual cash value. And you want to read your flood insurance policy and setting it up to see what condition is met here, because you don't want to find this out come flood insurance claims time in Pennsylvania. This is where people are disappointed. So when it comes to understanding those two options there and understanding, hey, what's going to be covered, what's not, how much coverage do you need in Pennsylvania? Now let's talk about elevation certificates a little bit in Pennsylvania. But when it comes to elevation certificates in Pennsylvania, they can still be very beneficial. But remember, the National Flood Insurance Program no longer requires them in most situations. Historically, we couldn't even give you a quote if a property was built after a certain period and you didn't have an elevation certificate and it was in a certain flood zone. Flood zones were a huge rate factor back then. Now, elevation certificates can still be a big beneficial on private and the National Flood Insurance Program, because they can show your elevation may be higher than it really is. It could show, because of that, you may qualify for a flood zone change, also called a letter of map amendment in Pennsylvania. And what you're looking for on this elevation certificate is that the lowest adjacent grade of your property is above what's called the base flood elevation. If you go back to the flood zone part of this video, when we talked about A and AE, the big difference there was that flood zone AE had a base flood elevation, which is the FEMA flood level. And that level plays a very important role in determining if you can do a flood zone change in a property. It also plays an important role on elevation below that or above that on your rates. So that's elevation certificates in Pennsylvania. You can click up here in the corner of this video to dive deeper into elevation certificates, where we've built a video and a guide that goes into everything you need to know about elevation certificates. Now, we've talked about flood insurance coverages and all that stuff. Now let's talk about, is flood insurance mandatory in Pennsylvania? And in order to understand that, we've got to go back and understand a few things. And that is your flood zone and if there's an additional interest on your property. Look, if you're in a special flood hazard area like A or AE and you have a mortgage or an additional interest, it's typically going to be required in Pennsylvania. So you want to remember that no matter where you're at in Pennsylvania, because that could have a big impact on your budget. And you want to make sure you prepare this budget as much as possible. Now, do you really need flood insurance in Pennsylvania? Look, if you've lived in Pennsylvania long enough, you know floods happen all the time. But a lot of people think, hey, I don't need flood insurance because my home insurance covers it. Well, typically, most Pennsylvania homeowners insurance policies do not cover flood damage. In order to understand that we've got to understand, what is flood damage? How is a flood defined in Pennsylvania? We're talking about when either 2 acres or 2 properties are inundated with water, normally dry. This has got to be surface water. So like you see right behind me, maybe a dam breaks, a lake, river comes rushing in, or it's flash flooding for rainfall. It's not groundwater coming up from snowmelt season. It's got to be surface water. This is considered to be flood damage, and it's got to actually enter your property. And typically, like we mentioned, most Pennsylvania homeowners insurance policies are excluding this. Now, some do have some endorsements that will cover certain things, but they're usually very limited. So I hope that you've enjoyed today's video on Pennsylvania flood insurance and everything you need to know as a homeowner. We try to answer as many questions as we can in this video, but we know we can't answer everything for you. And that's why down below, you can reach out to us. You can find our guide to Pennsylvania flood insurance down there where you can download that. Or maybe you're ready to get a quote on your flood insurance in Pennsylvania or look at changing that flood zone. 3 simple steps. Step 1, fill out the form on our website. Step 2, review your proposal. And step 3, finalize your policy. I'm Chris, the Flood Insurance Guru, and I want to say thank you for watching today's video, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next video. Remember, everybody is in a flood zone. Thank you.